Episode 7. 7 days. That was all the time Zimri had as king over Israel. He had seized the throne through bloodshed, destroying the house of Baasha in a single violent act. But when the army heard what he had done, they turned against him. Zimri knew his kingdom was finished, so he set fire to the royal palace around himself. And with his death, Israel was left without a king. But the northern kingdom did not have the luxury of peace. The army was already in the field, and another man was waiting. His name was Omri. He was not a prince. He was not the son of the fallen king. He was the commander of Israel's army. And now, with Zimri dead, the question was no longer whether Israel would have a new king. The question was, who would take the throne? Israel had entered another struggle for power. Another king would rise. Another dynasty would begin. And another chapter in the troubled history of the northern kingdom was about to unfold. This was the beginning of the reign of Omri. 7 days had passed since Zimri seized the throne of Israel. 7 days of violence. 7 days of fear. And now, the palace at Tirzah lay in ruins. Zimri was dead. The man who had murdered his way to the throne had discovered that the throne could not protect him. But his death did not bring peace to Israel. It created a vacuum. Israel still needed a king, and the army would have a major voice in deciding who that king would be. The man standing at the center of that uncertainty was Omri, commander of the army of Israel. Omri was not a member of the royal family. He had not inherited the throne. He had risen through the ranks of Israel's military, gaining the authority and loyalty necessary to command a nation's army. And now, the army stood behind him. But Israel was exhausted. For years, the northern kingdom had been trapped in a cycle of rebellion, assassination, and competing claims to the throne. Jeroboam had established the first dynasty. Nadab had inherited it. Baasha destroyed it. Elah inherited Baasha's throne. Zimri destroyed Baasha's house. And now, Zimri himself was gone. One dynasty after another had risen, and one dynasty after another had fallen. The throne of Israel had become a prize that could be taken by the sword. But Omri understood something that the men before him had learned too late. Taking the throne was one thing. Keeping it was another. The army had already recognized Omri as its leader. And when word spread that Zimri was dead, the political balance of Israel began to shift. The people needed stability. The soldiers needed a commander. And the kingdom needed someone strong enough to bring the northern tribes back under one authority. Omri appeared to be that man. But there was a problem. Not everyone in Israel agreed. Another faction wanted Tibni, son of Ginath, to become king. And suddenly, the death of Zimri had not ended Israel's struggle for power. It had only changed the names of the men fighting for the throne. Israel now stood divided. On one side was Omri, commander of the army. On the other was Tibni, supported by another portion of the people. The kingdom that had already endured assassination and civil conflict was once again being pulled apart. The biblical record tells us that the people were divided. And for a time,
neither man could completely control the kingdom. Omri had the army, Tibni had supporters, and Israel had another crisis. Yet Omri's position was growing stronger. The same military authority that had brought him to the forefront after Zimri's death would eventually give him the advantage.
But before Omri could become undisputed king, Israel would have to endure another struggle, another internal conflict, another test of whether the divided kingdom could survive. The age of Zimri was over. The age of Omri had begun. But Omri's throne had not yet been secured.
The death of Zimri had not settled the question of who would rule Israel. Instead, the kingdom was divided. On one side stood Omri, commander of the army. On the other stood Tibni, son of Ginneth. Both men had supporters. Both men had political strength, and both believed they had a legitimate claim to the throne. For Israel, this meant that the struggle for power was no longer simply a matter of replacing one king with another. The kingdom itself was being torn apart. The Bible records that the people of Israel were divided between the followers of Omri and the followers of Tibni. Two factions, two claims, one kingdom. Omri possessed a powerful advantage. He commanded the army. The soldiers who had turned against Zimri had already placed their confidence in their military commander. And in a kingdom where kings had repeatedly risen and fallen through violence, control of the army meant enormous political power. But Tibni was not powerless. He had supporters of his own, men throughout Israel willing to stand behind him and challenge Omri's claim. The conflict that followed was not settled in a single day. It was a struggle for control of the kingdom itself. Israel's cities and territories became part of a larger political contest. Behind the names of Omri and Tibni were thousands of ordinary Israelites who now faced uncertainty over who would govern them. Families watched soldiers move through their territories. Local leaders had to decide which claimant they would support. And every decision carried consequences. For Israel had already experienced the terrible cost of political ambition. Jeroboam's dynasty had fallen. Baasha's dynasty had fallen. Zimri had seized the throne and lost it almost immediately. Now, two more men were fighting over the same crown. But the biblical account makes something clear. Omri's position continued to strengthen. The army remained a powerful force behind him. His supporters were able to maintain pressure against Tibni's faction. And gradually, the balance of power began to shift. What had begun as a divided claim to the throne was becoming a contest that one man would eventually win. Tibni and his supporters resisted, but Omri's strength continued to grow. The struggle finally reached its decisive moment. The followers of Omri prevailed over the followers of Tibni, and Tibni died. The division that had threatened to fracture Israel had finally come to an end. There was now only one claimant left, Omri. The commander who had risen from the army was no longer merely a contender for the throne. He was king over Israel. But his victory came at a price. Another generation of Israelites had witnessed their kingdom divided by the pursuit of power. And another king had reached the throne through conflict. Omri had won the crown.
Now, he would have to decide what kind of kingdom he intended to build. And the answer would change the history of Israel forever.
The struggle for Israel's throne was over. Tibni had fallen, and Omri now stood alone as ruler of the northern kingdom. But winning the throne was only the beginning. Omri had inherited a kingdom exhausted by years of violence, assassinations, and political instability. 4 kings had risen and fallen in rapid succession.
Jeroboam's dynasty had disappeared. Baasha's dynasty had disappeared. Elah had been murdered. Zimri had taken the throne through conspiracy, only to destroy himself when his enemies closed in. Then, Israel had been divided between Omri and Tibni.
Now, at last, there was one king. But Omri understood that simply holding the throne would not be enough. He needed to create stability. He needed to strengthen the kingdom. And most importantly, he needed a new center of power.
The old royal city of Tirzah had become associated with rebellion, bloodshed, and destruction. Its palace had been burned. Its political importance had been damaged by years of violence. Omri needed a place that could represent something new. So he turned his attention toward the hill country of Samaria.
There, he found a hill that belonged to a man named Shemer. The hill stood in a strategically valuable location. From its heights, the surrounding valleys could be observed. The roads connecting different parts of the northern kingdom could be monitored, and the natural elevation provided an enormous advantage for defense.
Omri purchased the hill from Shemer for 2 talents of silver. Then he began to build. What happened next would change the history of Israel. Stone by stone, a new city began to rise. Israelite workers cut and shaped massive blocks of limestone.
Builders established foundations across the hilltop. Walls began to take shape. Structures rose above the surrounding landscape. And slowly, the hill that had once belonged to Shemer became the center of a new royal capital. Omri called the city Samaria, after Shemer, the former owner of the hill.
It was more than a construction project. It was a political statement. Omri was declaring that the period of instability was over. The northern kingdom would have a permanent royal center, a place from which its armies could be organized, a place where its rulers could govern, a place where foreign visitors could be received, a place that could project strength to Israel's enemies. Samaria's location gave Omri another advantage. The hill was surrounded by fertile valleys and important routes through the central highlands. The northern kingdom occupied an important position in the ancient Near East. To the north lay Phoenicia. To the east were the territories beyond the Jordan. To the south was Judah. And beyond these lands were powerful kingdoms and trading networks that connected the ancient world. Omri understood that Israel's survival depended not only on military strength, but also on political relationships. One of the most important of those relationships would come through Phoenicia. The city of Sidon was a wealthy and influential center along the Mediterranean coast. Its merchants, sailors, craftsmen, and rulers were connected to a vast network of trade. And Omri established an alliance with its royal house. That alliance would be sealed through marriage.
Omri's son was Ahab, and Ahab would marry Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. Politically, the marriage made sense. It strengthened Israel's relationship with Phoenicia.
It created a powerful international connection, and it demonstrated that Omri was thinking beyond the immediate survival of his kingdom. Israel was no longer simply recovering from internal rebellion. It was becoming an important regional power. But beneath the political advantages was a danger that Omri could not or would not see.
Jezebel did not come into Israel merely as a foreign princess. She brought with her the worship of Baal, and the alliance that strengthened Israel politically would eventually become one of the greatest spiritual threats the kingdom had ever faced. The Bible gives a devastating assessment of Omri's reign. Despite his political achievements, his judgment was not measured by the strength of his army.
It was not measured by the size of his new capital. It was not measured by the alliances he created. It was measured by his relationship with God. And Scripture says that Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord. In fact, his wickedness was described as greater than that of those who had ruled before him.
This is one of the great contrasts in Omri's story. From a political perspective, Omri was highly successful. He brought stability to a kingdom that had been repeatedly torn apart. He established a permanent capital. He strengthened Israel's international position.
He created a dynasty that would continue through his son. But spiritually, Omri was leading Israel in the wrong direction. The city he built would become famous. His dynasty would become powerful. His son would become one of the most well-known kings in Israel's history. And yet, beneath the political success, the spiritual condition of the kingdom was deteriorating. Samaria would eventually become more than the capital of Israel. It would become a symbol of the northern kingdom itself. Prophets would speak against it. Kings would rule from it.
Armies would march against it, and generations of Israelites would live beneath its walls. But the most important legacy of Omri would not be the stones he placed on that hill. It would be the direction he established for his kingdom. Omri had built a city.
He had strengthened a throne. He had created a dynasty. But he had also laid the foundation for a spiritual crisis that would soon become impossible to ignore. His son Ahab would inherit everything Omri had built: the throne, the kingdom, the capital,
The international alliances and the consequences of his father's choices. The age of Omri had begun, and with it came the rise of Samaria and the beginning of one of the darkest spiritual chapters in Israel's history. Ahab had inherited a powerful kingdom, but the strength of Israel's armies could not protect the nation from what was coming. The king had chosen his path. He had welcomed Jezebel into the royal household, established the worship of Baal in Samaria, and given the priests of a foreign god a place of honor within Israel. But Israel's God had not been silent. From the wilderness came a man who possessed no throne, no army, and no wealth. His name was Elijah. Elijah came before King Ahab with a message unlike anything the king expected to hear. There would be no warning of war. No invading army was approaching Samaria. Instead, the judgment would come from the heavens. winds. Elijah declared that there would be no dew or rain over the land except at his word. Then, before Ahab could answer, the prophet disappeared. The king was left with a kingdom that appeared strong on the outside, but a land that was about to become desperate for water. At first, Ahab may have believed the prophet's words would quickly prove false.
But the days passed, then the weeks. The skies remained dry. The fields began to suffer. Streams that had once carried water through the land grew smaller and smaller.
Across Israel, farmers watched their crops weaken beneath the relentless sun. Animals struggled to find water. Families began to understand that this was no ordinary season of drought. The drought was reaching every corner of the kingdom. And while Ahab searched for a way to protect his kingdom, Elijah was being protected by God.
The prophet was led away from the center of power, beyond the reach of the king. There, beside a small stream, Elijah waited. The kingdom of Ahab was beginning to experience the consequences of its spiritual rebellion. But Elijah's story was only beginning, and the drought would become more than a punishment.
It would become a declaration. Israel would soon have to answer a question its king had tried to ignore. Who truly ruled the land? Ahab sat upon the throne of Israel, but Elijah carried the word of the God of Israel. And before this story was finished, the king and the prophet would meet again.
The drought had spread across Israel. The fields were drying, the streams were disappearing, and the people were beginning to feel the weight of the judgment. But Elijah remained hidden from King Ahab. At the Kerith brook, the prophet had been sustained, while the kingdom around him suffered. But even the brook would not last forever. The drought continued, and eventually the stream dried up. Elijah now faced the same lack of water that had overtaken the land, but his God had not forgotten him. The word of the Lord came to Elijah again. He was told to leave the brook and travel northward, beyond the borders of Israel, to a place called Zarephath. There, Elijah would find a widow. She would be the one God had chosen to provide for him. Zarephath was a Phoenician town situated between Tyre and Sidon, in the very region from which Jezebel had come. Elijah was being sent into the land connected to the royal influence that had helped bring Baal worship into Israel. And there, in a foreign land, God was about to reveal his power through an ordinary woman.
When Elijah arrived at the gate of Zarephath, he saw a woman gathering sticks. He called to her and asked for some water. As she went to get it, Elijah called after her and asked for a piece of bread as well. The woman stopped. She told him that she had no bread prepared.
She had only a handful of flour remaining in her jar and a little oil in a container. She had been gathering sticks to prepare one final meal for herself and her son. After that, she believed they would have nothing left. Elijah answered her with words that must have sounded impossible. He told her not to be afraid.
He instructed her to make a small loaf for him first, and then prepare something for herself and her son. And he gave her a promise. The flour would not be exhausted. The oil
would not run dry. The widow had a choice.
She could hold on to the little she had left, or she could trust the word of the prophet. She chose to trust. The woman went home and did as Elijah had said, and something remarkable happened.
The flour in her jar did not run out. The oil in her container did not disappear. Day after day, there was enough. While the kingdom of Ahab struggled beneath the drought, God was sustaining a widow and her son in a foreign land. Elijah had left the royal court with nothing but the word of God. Now, in the home of a poor widow, that word was proven stronger than the drought. But the story of Zarephath was not finished, because the greatest test for this widow, her son, and Elijah was still ahead.
For a time, the widow's household was sustained. The drought had not ended, but the flour in her jar did not run out, and the oil continued to provide what they needed. The woman had trusted the word of Elijah, and God had kept his promise. But then, another tragedy entered her home. Her son became sick.
His condition grew worse until eventually the boy died. The widow was devastated. She had already lost almost everything to the drought. Now, she had lost her only son. She cried out to Elijah, unable to understand why this had happened after God had miraculously preserved their lives.
The widow knew that what had happened could only have come from God. She had seen God's power in the flour and oil. Now, she had seen his power over death. But Elijah's time at Zarephath was not the end of the story. The drought continued.
And back in Israel, King Ahab still ruled. Samaria remained under the influence of Baal worship. The people of Israel were still suffering beneath the judgment that had been announced years earlier. Ahab had seen his kingdom dry up. He had watched his livestock disappear.
He had watched the land suffer, but he still had not turned his heart back to the Lord. 3 years had passed since Elijah first declared that there would be neither dew nor rain except at his word. And now, the Lord was ready to act again. The time had come for Elijah to leave Zarephath. He would return to Israel. He would stand before King Ahab, and the drought that had brought Israel to its knees would soon lead to one of the greatest confrontations in the history of the kingdom. The king was about to meet the prophet again. And this time, Elijah would not be speaking from a distance. He would be standing directly before Ahab. The confrontation was coming.
Ahab had become king, but Israel was moving farther from the Lord. Under his rule, Baal worship grew strong that would expose Israel's rebellion. But the drought was not over, and Ahab's greatest confrontation with Elijah was still ahead. The story continues in episode 8.